Okay. Um, anyway, the structure of the pollen grains is important. We're going to look at that a little bit. And remember that the shape, color, and nutrient composition of pollen depends on the plant. And it's good to have a diversity of pollen coming into the hive. And the midgut is lined by a special structure that I'm interested in. It's called the parotrophic matrix. And we'll see some photos of that. And we'll think also about pathogens such as viruses and nosema. And pesticides oftentimes enter the bee via the midgut. And so that midgut is very important because that's where the food is digested and where the bad stuff gets in. So we've spent a lot of time looking at bee midguts. And we'll think a little bit about water foraging, which depends on the crop, the temporary storage organ. And then honey production depends on the crop, the proboscis, glands in the head, and very interesting cooperation among the worker bees. We all know, but the bees start out this way as these little white hot dogs in the cells, and we have to get used to looking at these guys, and they last in the egg stage for about 3 days, and then they hatch, become larvae, and then these larvae grow amazingly fast compared to other insects. They grow many times their original size, from the size of an egg to filling the entire cell in only 6 days. So that is really astonishing, and that is because they're getting this very nutrient-rich food. In this case, it's the worker jelly, not much in the way of pollen or anything else, and so it's all digestible. And then the larva then stretches out, fills the cell, spins a very thin cocoon. This is a caterpillar spins a cocoon. The bee mature larva also spins a cocoon. And then it goes through this profound change. Just as a caterpillar turns into a butterfly, a bee larva goes through the pupal stage and becomes an adult bee, which is entirely different from the larva. Okay, so we see these progressions. If you ever pull the pupae out of the cells, which you might want to do once in a while, just take a look, you can see that it gets darker, and then the adult features appear: the eyes, the legs, the wings, and so forth. And the eye color is a really good indicator of how old it is. And eventually you get the darker eyes. And then when the bee is almost ready to come out, you can see all the features are here: the proboscis or tongue. You can just sort of barely see the wings back here. And there's hairs growing all over the bee, including its eyes are covered with hairs. And the stinger is appearing down here if it's a worker bee or a queen. And if it's a queen or a drone, the reproductive organs are happening inside of the abdomen. So all these huge changes occur in a pretty short time. Really, the pupal stage is only 12 days for a worker, and shorter than that for a queen bee. So to understand the bee, we put it in context with insects. All us bee folks, we had to study entomology and learn about other insects too. And all insects are composed of 3 body parts, which is the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. And the head is specialized for feeding and for the sense organs. So the proboscis, the mandibles, the eyes, the antennae. Thorax is for moving around by legs and wings. And the abdomen is specialized for digesting food, for reproduction in the males and females, queens and drones if it's a bee. The heart is in there, the stinger is in there, and there's a lot going on in the abdomen here. So this is be a cutaway drawing of the worker bee, which you can kind of visualize when you're looking at that frame of bees. It's going to be kind of a nice day tomorrow if you're going to go out to the bees, or the next day. And this is what's happening inside. Okay, we've got a number of glands in the head, which are very important. Hypopharyngeal gland for feeding the brood and the queen. And in fact, if this is a nurse bee, which is maybe 5 or 10 days old and very well fed and very active when brooding is happening, these hypopharyngeal glands are just packed. They're like a cluster of grapes, and they're just jammed into the head between the eyes and take up maybe half of the head capsule. If it's a very young bee or an older forager bee, these hypopharyngeal glands shrink. And now that we're into October, there's not much nurse bee activity, although there's still some. And so these glands are shrinking. And then there are salivary glands to soften food, mandibular glands, which also feed, produce gland secretions for the larvae and the queen. And then the queen bee, the mandibular gland, produces pheromones. So anyway, this is the cutaway of the head, and we don't, there's the antenna. The eye is out of view here. They're compound eyes, and there's some little tiny little eyes up here on the top of the head. And then the thorax is mostly flight muscle. The esophagus goes through the thorax, and the aorta, which is a blood vessel, goes through the thorax. But almost all of this is flight muscle. And one time we were trying to dissect some of the flight muscle out of the thorax, and man, it is locked in. Oh my gosh, it is the hardest thing I've ever tried to dissect, even with a sharp scalpel. And it kind of makes sense too, because if you think about it, the bee is, when it's flying, it's flapping its wings maybe several hundred times a second. And if it's flying some hours a day, and then day after day, week after week, it really needs those strong flight muscles to be really well glued into the thorax and the top and the bottom. And that's exactly what it is. And then in the wintertime, it needs its thoracic muscles also, because that's how it warms itself. The bees in the winter will cluster, they will consume honey and turn the sugars in honey into heat by contracting their flight muscles, just as we make heat when we use our muscles. Same thing with the bees. And so the bees will cluster. And if you have like a thermogram of the bee cluster in winter, the thorax is really prominent because it's generating heat. It's giving off infrared light, and much more so than the head or the abdomen. So that's really essential. And then the abdomen here opens up into the crop, which is a temporary storage organ for food or water, followed by a valve called the proventriculus, which the bee can open or close, followed by the midgut, which is also called the ventriculus. It goes by those two different names. I call it the midgut. And that's where all the action happens, that really important structure. And then that's followed by, it looks like yellow spaghetti under the microscope, all these long strands floating around, which are the Malpighian tubules, which are like the kidneys of the bee. They clean the blood of toxins and dump those toxins into this spot right here, this is called the ileum, which connects the midgut to the rectum. And then those toxins go out with the fecal material. And the rectum is really important because, boy, these bees, they can't just go out and fly every 10 minutes. You know, that would be very inconvenient. It's important for the bee to be able to keep the hive clean by having a rectum that functions, that can store the fecal material until the bee is able to get outside. And there are times when this rectum is distended to fill half of the abdomen. And you can tell this bee really needs to get outside. And if you've ever parked your car near your beehives and it stops raining for a while and the bees all come out, then you'll see that the rectum is a really important organ for the bee. And it's partly from the parts of pollen that are undigestible. We'll talk a little bit more about that soon. And way back here, we have the stinger, which is connected to the venom glands. We have wax glands down here, which become really big when the bees are making comb, especially when they're on a honey flow. And it all fits together amazingly enough. So we're going to take a little tour. I'm going to add in here also, we have this all the insides of the bee is filled with blood, but it's not red like our blood because it doesn't have hemoglobin. It transports mineral or nutrients and waste products through all the organ, and it's sucked up by this heart, which is open at this end, and the blood is sucked up through this tube and comes around here and through what they call the aorta, and then the blood is dumped into the head capsule and washes over the glands and the eyes and the brain and the antennae, and then circulates back past the thoracic muscles back into the abdomen, and then sucked up here again. So all these organs don't have little capillary arteries and veins like we do. It's just sort of a sloshing situation. The bee system is not as efficient as ours is, but it works pretty well for a little creature. So the blood is sloshing around in here, and then there are also breathing tubes, tracheal tubes, that branch in to the bee. On the right side and the left side are a whole bunch of little holes that allow the air to come in and out in the head and the thorax and the abdomen. And when you dissect them, they look silvery because they have air inside of them. So we're going to take a trip here and start out with a proboscis, which is the tongue of the bee. It's kind of like it's like a drinking straw that folds under the head. In fact, if you have a bee that's unconscious, if you can sometimes knock it out with putting it on ice or whatever, you can unfold the proboscis and see what the bees do. They extend it when they're drinking, for example, water or honey, or taking liquid from another bee, which is very common. And then the mandibles are the sort of the grabbing organ that come on the right and the left side. That's for grabbing solids, or maybe grabbing a varroa mite off of another bee, or whatever needs to be done. So the mandibles pull solid food, and they're also used to form wax and to comb, and to groom nest mates. And if somebody is coming into the hive that doesn't belong there, the guard bees will rush up and grab those critters, whether robber bees or yellow jackets or whatever. They'll use their mandibles to grab them. Then after the proboscis and the mandibles, there's a mouth cavity inside the head, and then a long esophagus, which is like ours. It's just a food tube, a long tube that leads to the crop. Okay, so here's the mandibles, which are, you can see them pretty easily if you look closely at a bee. And it's used, for example, for grabbing pollen off of a flower. And then the bees will move the pollen using their legs and pack it into the hind leg, the little pollen basket in the hind leg. So, and the bees will add a little bit of liquid like nectar or honey to make it into a sticky ball. And this is what pollen grains look like under high-powered microscope, electron microscope. You can see that they all look very different according to the species of plant. Okay. And it's really kind of fun to look at these. If you have a microscope that can go up to 400 power, it's pretty easy to see them. And you can get the pollen off of the flowers by, you can cut the flowers and put them in a jar with water and let them sit for a while, and let the flowers lean over a piece of white paper or some kind of paper that you can see where the pollen is falling. And over a day or so, you can tap the flowers and a little bit of pollen will come off. And you carefully move that pollen with maybe with a little paintbrush onto a microscope slide, and put a cover slip on with a little bit of water. And then at 400 power, you can see these structures. Now this is at higher power here. You won't see quite this many details, but you can see it almost as good. And you can see these all sorts of great variety of things. We were just looking at some goldenrod pollen just the other day, and it's because the goldenrod is out, and that's really interesting to look at. And here, a familiar sight is the bees coming back home with pollen on their legs, and they bring it into the hive. And then when they get into the hive, they find an empty cell, or maybe a cell that's half filled with pollen. And then they kick this off with their back legs into the cell. Sort of like we can kick off our slippers using our feet only. You know, we can kick off one slipper and then the other one. The bees do the same thing. They kick off these little pollen loads into a pollen cell. And oftentimes you'll see one pollen cell has more than one color of pollen, and that's really good because each flower produces pollen with a different nutrient makeup. So some are higher in some amino acids or other vitamins or minerals or whatever. So to get a balanced diet, it's good for the colony as a whole to go out after multiple sources of pollen and get all those different colors coming in. And this is what we might then see is all these packed in pollen. Here's some of this a little bit red. A lot of it's kind of yellowish. And that's the bees' reserve. Probably what they're packing away right now, it should be able to get them until early spring, let's hope. So we need them to have that, all that protein and vitamins and nutrients to get them through the winter and get ready to be good nurse bees in the spring when the queen starts laying again here. Now we can collect pollen from hives using a pollen trap. There's different designs. This is just one design. And the idea of a pollen trap is that it forces the bees to wiggle through a screen, and then the pollen balls fall off of the bee down into the trap. And then the beekeeper can take empty the trap. You have to do it pretty often, perhaps once a day, so this pollen doesn't spoil. And then you've got to clean it and so forth. If you leave a pollen trap on a long time, you'll really weaken the hive. It'll really cut into the brood ring. So don't leave it on for a long time. If you want to collect pollen for whatever reason, just do it for a few days, a week at the most, I would say. And then if you go to the trouble, somebody went to a lot of trouble here to sort out the pollen, but this is a nice picture. It shows a bunch of different colors of pollen. So this is, I don't know what that is exactly, but it might be henbit or something. But you can see there are distinct differences in the color of the pollen. Okay, so the nectar and the pollen gets up through the proboscis or via the mandibles into the mouth or the cibarium, and then it's going to move down the esophagus and then into the crop. And this crop is a very thin, transparent organ. When you dissect it, you have to be really careful because it breaks so easily. It's really hard to get the crop out without breaking it. It's just like a very fragile, thin balloon. Now, if this bee is coming home from, say, a flower and is full of nectar, this crop can extend like almost half of the abdomen and push all the other organs out of the way. And then the bee will probably release the crop contents either to another bee or to a cell where it can be, if it's honey or nectar, it can be really ripened into honey. And that's a very special process in itself. So the crop is for temporary storage, and sometimes the bee will open this little valve and release some food into its midgut for its own nutrition, because the bee, of course, the forager bee is mostly going out to collect food, but it has to nourish itself too a little bit. And so it opens this little valve, the proventriculus, and lets some food go into the midgut. So, as I said, it's very thin, transparent, and flexible. It really stretches. And the bee can carry almost its own weight, and which is amazing because it flies everywhere. And to carry its own weight when it's flying, maybe into the wind, that's quite a job. And that weight can be in nectar, honey, or water. And if the bee has had a good foraging flight, that crop will be full. And back in the hive, it releases this liquid either to a cell or to another bee. And generally, nectar foragers don't put that nectar straight into a cell. They give it to another bee. There are certain bees called unloader bees, and their whole job, their specialty, is to accept that nectar from a forager and then take it into a cell for ripening, while the forager bee then turns around and goes right back out. It's important that the bees be very efficient. Bees are incredibly efficient in how they spend their time and energy. And so the forager bees just come in, unload, and go out, sort of like a truck driver would come into a loading dock, let somebody else unload the truck, and then zoom off for another load and come back. And so there are unloaders in the beehive. And then this proventriculus is a special valve, as I mentioned, can keep the bee has a choice of opening or closing the ventriculus. Now here's a little picture that actually was taken by somebody I don't know. It was sent to me. It started out as a picture taken by a Georgia beekeeper, and they said, "What is this bee right here? Is this a mutant bee, or what happened to this? Why is this bee red?" Well, as remember, the front part of the abdomen is the crop, and the crop is full when the bee is coming home full of some kind of liquid. And why is it red? Well, the abdomen is somewhat transparent, and probably this bee discovered some sweet material like candy or fruit drink, and which was out who knows where available to it. Bees will collect this stuff. And since the bee is slightly transparent, it's apparent. Now, in 20 or 30 minutes, this bee would not look this way. This bee would release the crop contents to a cell or somebody else. So it's just this bee has just recently come home. Now, sometimes beekeepers discover these brightly colored liquids in their comb, and this has been reported by many people. Then, because the bees are out, they find candy someplace, or they find Mountain Dew, or some kind of soft drink, and it's sweet to them, and they figure that let's take it home and eat it. So um, bees have even been discovered feeding on gummy bears, which are usually brightly colored. And so then the beekeeper sees, oh, we got bright red honey and bright green honey. What is this all about? So we all always have to think about where our bees might be foraging. And remember, the bees can fly for miles from our hives, and that includes a huge area, many square miles around our hives. And so it's hard to really tell really just where our bees have been. So there's the proventriculus, which is usually in a closed position, but it's open once in a while. And this is a picture we took through the microscope. We made a slice, longitudinal slice. This is the crop, which is very thin, is partly collapsed. And then the proventriculus has sort of like fingers that are reaching into the crop, and there's like little how do I call it? Almost like little hairs that extend into the crop and pull solid materials like pollen grains back into the midgut, which is what we have here. So this is a little piece of muscle right here. And then here is the midgut. And I think this is maybe the opening slide. And in the midgut, we see the cells here that surround it. Now, this midgut has been pulled out of the bee. Okay, this has been pulled out of the bee and sliced into very thin slices so that we can actually see this tissue. And then it's been stained with a stain that gives it this sort of a blue-white glow. And so inside here, we see these are the cells that are busy doing the very important work of taking in nutrients, all the protein and vitamins and minerals and sugars and everything that the bee needs to run on. And so we slice lengthwise. So this is one side of the midgut, and this is the other side. And then in the inside, we see a very thin structure called the peristrophic matrix, which is sort of protective. It protects the midgut, sometimes from pathogens. And it also acts sort of like a scaffolding for digestive enzymes. Have you ever seen scaffolding on the outside of a tall building and the workers are on the scaffolding? They need a place to stand while they work on the building. And in the same way, the enzymes are attached to this matrix so they can do their work of digesting proteins and carbohydrates and so forth. So that's why I call it a scaffolding. And it also is sort of like a sieve or a sleeve that protects the bee from sometimes pesticides and sometimes pathogens. Here's another slice that's the same thing, but stained with a little bit differently so we can see different colors. And you can see how there's all these sort of wiggles, just like our intestines have lots of wiggles to increase the surface area. And then we see the proventriculus is protruding into the crop. The crop is kind of collapsed here. Imagine like a very thin bed sheet that's collapsed, and so it's got lots of wiggles in it. Normally it's extended and it's just like a very thin balloon-like structure here. So the midgut is, of course, really critical. We spend a lot of time looking at midguts in our lab. And one thing that happens here is that the pollen grains break open to release the nutrients, which are, this actually should say protein, vitamins, minerals, and sterols into the midgut. And then honey is largely water, sugars, and amino acids and traces of other nutrients. Honey is pretty easy to digest, but the pollen grains have to break open. And as I mentioned earlier, viruses and nosema enter the midgut, enter the bee through the midgut. And there's also a whole bunch of other microbes in the midgut and the rectum. And in fact, as we study all animals, every kind of animal, whether it's a giraffe or a whale or a bee or an earthworm, we all have microbes inside of us. And this is really important. More and more, we're beginning to understand how important these are to human health, and all aspects of our lives are very much dependent on these amazing microbes, the trillions of them of all different kinds. And they're important in the bee too. And some of them are beneficial. They're helping digest the food. Some of them are pathogenic, like like the Nosema organism, for example, and there's some others. And and a whole lot of them are neutral. They're just hitchhikers, as they say. And that's including humans too. We have a lot of microbes in our system that are just there for a free ride. It's a great place to live. There's free food and nice warm place to live. We are just jam full of these things. And a lot is still left to be discovered about these microbes. Even plants have their own microbiome, especially around the root system. So anyway, here's the midgut, and it curls around like this and connects to a tube called the ileum, which then connects to the rectum. As I mentioned, the peritrophic matrix, para means around and trophic means food. So this matrix is around the food, and it's like a scaffolding, and it's very, very fine, just like an incredibly fine fabric, just the sheerest fabric. And it's really fun to look at this under the microscope. In fact, this is a picture that we took, a close-up picture of some of the layers of this. We call it the PM. And you can see the layers are so fine, you can actually see through them. And because they're very thin and they're covered with many, many tiny holes, so small that even a virus can't pass through them. The holes do allow water and the very smallest molecules to go through. But the PM sometimes gets damaged, and that does allow a lot of bad stuff to get through. So that's one thing we're trying to understand, is how the peritrophic matrix is supported and produced. It's sort of secreted, kind of like our fingernails or our hair are continuously secreted by our bodies. This structure also continues to be secreted in the midgut of the bee and do its job here. Here's some pollen. This is actually from some samples from Jefferson County some years back. And it looks like all these pollen grains are from the same kind of plant. And you can see they're kind of like rounded pyramids, is the way I describe them. I don't know what plant this is offhand. The way to know is to go out to individual plants and collect pollen. But you can see, it looks like the diet of this bee was of pollen grains of the same plant species. Now here's another picture of partially digested pollen. And this, you can see here what happens. A lot of these pollen grains have cracked open. This one's cracked open, and this one has, and this one has. And that is very important, because the most important part of the nutrients in a pollen grain are on the inside. And the pollen grain has points of weakness on it. You think a little bit of like a peanut shell or a walnut shell that has these sort of crevices in it. And if you want to crack a peanut, you push it together a certain way and break it open. And then the peanut itself comes out of the shell. Same deal here. These pollen grains are cracking open inside the midgut and releasing all those really good nutrients. So it's something about being in the midgut that causes these things to break open. And then further on down the line, you get into the rectum and you just see little fragments of pollen grains. Now, the outside of the pollen grain is not completely digestible. Those all go into the rectum, and that's why there's a lot of bulk to what is held in the rectum, and that's why the bees have to get outside once in a while. It's part of them having a pollen diet. Here's another close-up view of these pollen grains. Now these are glowing because we put a special stain on them that makes them glow under ultraviolet light. They don't normally glow. It just helps us to see them a little bit better. Okay, here's another close-up of the midgut, and here's the PM. And actually these pollen grains are being held inside of the PM. And actually it's a bunch of sort of like sleeves, concentric sleeves. Imagine if you're wearing 5 or 6 socks on one foot. Each one of those socks overlaps another sock. It's the same thing. This PM is multiple sleeves that are being secreted out of these midgut cells. And then inside, you can see these pollen grains. And you can also see nosema spores and other things that the bees might be consuming. Okay, nosema, this is something I've been interested in a while. It's interesting because these spores have a special way of reproducing. And what happens is Bees will consume the spores for one reason or another. Maybe there's some contamination on the comb, and these spores will get into the midgut, and then something causes the spores to germinate. And by germinate, I mean they shoot out this very, very long tube, which is incredible to see. I've actually seen it happen a few times. And I was able to do this because you can put some spores on a microscope slide and add certain liquids that will cause the spore to germinate, sort of stimulate it to germinate artificially. And the first time I did it, I was just amazed. And I was watching these, looking at these spores, and I wasn't expecting the germination fluid to really work. But then I saw one spore and just started wiggling and wiggling and wiggling back and forth. It's sort of like, as you're waiting for a meal and the server gives you your buzzer, and the buzzer goes off and it's bzzz like that, which means it's time to get up and go get your food. That's sort of what it was like. It was wiggling and wiggling, and then all of a sudden, this very long tube comes out snaking. I couldn't get it all in one photograph. It went way beyond where this photograph is, and it came entirely out in about 5 seconds. And I thought, wow, that is really amazing. And then I watched again, and then I saw another spore and wiggling and wiggling and wiggling, and suddenly it shot out of a very, very long tube. And so we're trying to understand this a little bit better. Obviously, for nosema to be a disease, it has to be able to infect the bees. And if we can interfere with this process somehow, that would be a good thing. So we see here, there's a lot of nosema spores. All these white ovals are spores. And then here's another picture we took of an infected midgut. Now here, this is pretty close, high magnification. And we put some stains on this tissue so that we could see everything better. Now, just for reference, on the right side, this dark area, that's the inside of the midgut. That's where all the food would be, that the bee is probably digesting. And on the outside, these reddish and yellowish tissues are the bee's midgut cells. So those are honeybee cells who have the purpose of digesting food, secreting enzymes, and absorbing those nutrients. And then they transport those nutrients into the blood of the bee. And that's what's out here. Because if you remember, the midgut is kind of floating in the blood of the abdomen. So these cells then push all those good nutrients into the blood, and then that blood circulates out to the thorax and the head and everything. And then this bluish green is the peritrophic matrix, and it's kind of stuck, it's kind of being secreted. You can see in some places kind of secreting out of these cells, but it's really been degraded because all these white things are nosema spores. And you can see we artificially got this bee sick. We were pretty mean to these bees. We fed them spores while they were caged, spores in sugar syrup, and sacrificed them. This is about 9 days after they were fed the spores. And we can see as the infection got started here and here and here, and then multiplied. So all these spores started multiplying over about 9 days. And you can imagine how this poor bee is going to have a hard time absorbing all these good nutrients, because all these digestive cells in the bee's midgut are compromised. And it's kind of like if you or I had the stomach flu and then we said, oh, I guess I'll go run a marathon today. Well, we probably couldn't do it, okay, because our whole system is bogged down by the stomach virus flu. And it's the same thing here. Can you imagine this bee trying to go out and forage and come home with a full load of nectar? Well, it'd be pretty rough. Or if this bee were a nurse bee and it needed to absorb a lot of nutrients to make the glandular food for the larvae, the nurse bee would not be a very good nurse. And so brood rearing would decline. So sometimes we look at our hives and we see, boy, this one hive is just not brooding up very well. Why is that? And we might blame the queen. We might blame ourselves. We might say, well, it's not bringing in enough food. There's a lot of causes for bees not rearing brood very well. But one possibility is their midgut is infected with nosema or viruses or something else. And we can really visualize all these sometimes millions of spores infecting a midgut and see how that really hurts the poor bee. Okay, here's another thing we oftentimes see, especially in the spring, but sometimes other times. So bees will come out and they will defecate on the hive entrance. Okay, and we call this dysentery because it's uncontrolled defecation, and the bees will crawl up and defecate, or maybe they'll fly out and defecate in front of the hive. It's not always a sign of nosema disease. In fact, I've gone to scrape off some of these spots from my hives or other hives belonging to other beekeepers. A lot of times there's no sign of nosema in those scrapings at all. Sometimes it's due to some other problem with the diet of the bees, and I can't tell you what. There's a beekeeper not too far from me, who brought in some bees that had this problem. They were defecating on some of his equipment. He brought in an entrance reducer and some frames, and we scraped the poop off of it, and no sign of nosema. Okay, something else was causing this. So it's a little bit confusing here to know just what that is. So the Malpighian tubules I mentioned are very long, thin, like yellow spaghetti. And they pull the waste out of the bee blood, whatever that waste would be. Could be even a little bit of pesticides that got into the bee or something else that's not good for them. And they dump that into the end of the midgut, where just before it goes into the rectum. So, and as I mentioned also, the bee blood is not red, it's clear. And same is true for all insects, and it's not contained in blood vessels. The blood just kind of sloshes over everything, and insects are small enough that they don't have to be really efficient. Big creatures like us or whales or elephants, we have to be efficient in how we move the blood through our bodies, and that's why we run little capillary tubes through past every cell. So I colored in some of the Malpighian tubules there. Then there's the ileum, which connects the midgut to the rectum. And by the way, there are all sorts of mysterious microbes in every part of the midgut, ileum, and rectum that we are just beginning to see, and it's very hard to understand. It's really kind of like a jungle of all sorts of creatures that are interacting, and all we know is that there's a whole bunch of them, and there's many different kinds, and that's about as far as we can go right now. And there's some rectal pads, which probably are for absorbing water or minerals before it comes out with the fecal material. So it's very important that our bees be able to make their cleansing flights outdoors. Of course, we cannot control the weather, but we do know that the bees need to get out. And if it's rainy for many consecutive days, like in early spring, it does sometimes explain why the bees are not really doing well. It's because pollen is building up. It's not completely digestible. And the outside of the pollen grain, the exine, is just sort of refractory. It's just like these are just chunks that don't get digested. So that's just part of it. It's also worth considering that the nurse bees are doing some really important work in the hive, because they're eating all this pollen, and then they're turning that real pollen, which is only partly digestible, into very digestible gland secretions. So they're a little bit like mammals. Mammals eat all kinds of food, depending on what kind of species they are, and turn, if they're female, if they're nursing mothers, they turn some of that food into milk, which is highly digestible, which is very good for their young. So it's a little bit like milk production in mammals, the nurse bees eating pollen and converting those nutrients into something that's very digestible. Okay, here's something called trophallaxis. That's a good word if you ever might get it on a crossword puzzle sometime. It just means food sharing among individuals, and it happens a lot. Now, we normally don't see it when we open our hive, because when we open a hive, even if we're very cautious, we're disturbing the bees, and they stop doing a lot of things. They stop doing waggle dances. They stop doing trophallaxis. They just start paying attention to us. But this is very common if you have an observation hive, which I really recommend if you're inclined to have one. You can see this because the observation hive has a clear plastic side, and you can look in and watch this sort of stuff happening. You've got to look very closely. It's usually not as clear cut as this, but here this bee has its proboscis extended. This bee has its mandibles open and is releasing, the crop is back here, is releasing some of the crop contents for this bee to take up. So the colony of bees basically has a social stomach. If some bees are bringing in lots and lots of rich nectar, in a short time, all of the bees in that colony have that kind of nourishment. And small hive beetles, these nasty little guys too, can engage a little bit in trophallaxis. They can trick bees into feeding them. They've evolved that ability, and they can tap the bees in a certain way on their antennae and get the bees to offer up some food here. And then I showed this picture before, this red bee with some kind of a candy or something inside of it. Okay, now let's talk about summer. Very important that the bees can collect water someplace. And usually bees find water someplace. It's amazing. They can go, bees have been known to go something like 8 miles if they're in a desert and they can't find water any closer. They will go incredible distances to get water. But we really should have water closer to them. They're pretty good at finding it, creeks or gutters or swimming pools or wherever they can usually find it. This I think is a bird bath. And a bird bath is a great place for bees because they can perch right there. You can see the proboscis is going down into to drink water. This bee, they're all extending their proboscises and pulling that water back into their crop. And they will take that home, and then they will use that to cool their hive on a hot, dry day. It's very, very important. And this is a cross section of what the comb might look like. Of course, many cells are taken up by a pupa or larvae of different ages or eggs, but the bees can also use some of these cells for water. So the bees will collect water and deposit droplets like that one and that one on the surface of the wax cell. And then they fan their wings over the comb and at the hive entrance. Sometimes on a hot afternoon, you'll see the bees fanning their wings at the entrance, and circulating the air over that comb is a great way to cool the hive, because as the water evaporates, the whole hive is cooled. So that's a really good system for cooling the hive. And the bees do a good job of keeping that temperature down if they have a chance. So having a large population is helpful too, because you need a lot of bees to get the water and a lot of bees to do the fanning. And then the bees will also beard on the front of the hive in late summer so that they're not making a lot of heat inside the hive. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about honey, because that certainly has to do with the digestive system of the bee. And by definition, it's a sweet liquid made from bees, and to sustain them during periods of dearth, winter and rainy periods and so forth. But specifically, it's made by bees from nectar. Okay, if doesn't start out as nectar in flowers, it's not honey. Okay, if they collect it from any kind of artificial sweetener or some other sweet stuff, it's something else. So you can't sell it as honey or pretend it's honey if it doesn't start out from nectar. And by the way, honey is made by other bees also, but not quite so much. Other Apis species, which are the close relative, our honeybee is Apis mellifera. There's also Apis cerana, Apis dorsata, and so forth, that live in Asia. Those bees also make honey. Bumblebees make a little bit of honey, but bumblebee colonies don't overwinter, so they don't really have to have a big hoard of honey. They just have a few little thimblefuls of honey to get them through a dry stretch. And a curious bunch of bees called stingless bees that live in the tropics also make honey. These are really neat if you ever get to the tropics and you get a chance to see these stingless bees. It's really fascinating. They are social. They have queens and workers. They make comb, which looks very different from a honeybee comb. And And some of the bees were worshipped by the Mayan civilization because of their sophisticated behavior and comb structure and so forth. Now, solitary species of bees, and there are many thousands of solitary species of bees, sweat bees and leafcutter bees and orchard bees, they do not produce honey because they don't have to get through long periods of dearth, and they don't overwinter as warm clusters. So nectar is produced in the nectaries of some flowers to attract bees and other pollinators, and it consists of basically water, lots of water and sugar mostly, and then smaller amounts of minerals and little bits of amino acids and aromatic materials, things that give color and aroma to the honey. But the sugars are basically sucrose, which is table sugar, which is 12 carbons, fructose, fruit sugar with 6 carbons, and glucose is blood sugar. If our blood sugar is low or high, that's what we're talking about, the glucose in our system. They're all sweet to bees and they're all sweet to people, but they are a little bit different chemically. And sucrose can be split from the 12 carbon molecule into a glucose and a fructose, which are each 6 carbons here. And that's what happens when the bees are making honey. The bees add a special enzyme called invertase, which splits the sucrose molecule using a little bit of water into a glucose and a fructose. So it's interesting, when the bees are making honey, they are actually using some water up chemically to make this split. And the bees are also evaporating some of the water in the nectar to dry it down. So there's 2 ways that bees dry their honey. One is by fanning the wings over the nectar, and one is by converting the sucrose into glucose and fructose. And it's good to know that some plants differ a lot, because this then affects the honey that comes from these plants. Like black locust is high in fructose, and tupelo trees, which are way out by the Mississippi River and down south, those are pretty high in fructose. And some flowers like canola, we have very little canola in Kentucky, mostly it's up north. Canola is very high in glucose, which is not so good because it tends to crystallize more readily. And so a lot of beekeepers do not like getting canola honey because it'll just crystallize right there in the comb and you can't even extract it. It's kind of frustrating kind of honey to work with, and it'll crystallize very quickly in the jar. Dandelion also has high glucose, although usually we don't have fields and fields of dandelions, but it is another contributor to the nectar flow of what we have in Kentucky. And a cross section of flower, this is sort of a typical flower. I imagine it's maybe an apple blossom, which is kind of a typical flower. And of course, you've got the green sepal and the petal, and the reproductive parts. The stigma, which is the female part, the anther is the male part. And way down at the bottom is the nectary, where the sweet liquid is produced by the plant. The plant is trying to lure a pollinator, a bee or a butterfly, to come all the way down in here and get that nectar, and in doing so, to brush pollen from the anther of one flower onto the stigma of another flower, and thereby achieve pollination. So the flower is very cleverly designed by the plant to encourage pollination when the insect, bee, or whatever it is comes in to get the food. And then enzymes are produced. The enzyme producing glands in the worker honeybee are primarily in the hypopharyngeal glands, which look like grape clusters. If you dissect these out of the bee, they can really be full and pack into the heads when the bee is busy doing this. And so these enzymes to make the honey come out of these glands. And then what's really cool to watch, I get to see this one time, and again, I'm back to observation hives now. I happened to watch an observation hive that was set up so that it was building comb against the clear glass wall. And what's more is the bees were ripening honey in the cells that were against the clear glass wall. And you could watch the bees, what they call elaborating the nectar into honey. The bee would take up some of the nectar and then add a little enzyme and then release it back into the cell, and then draw it up and release it again, back and forth, very gradually making nectar into honey. And it's really fun to watch this. If you set up your observation hive in the right way, they will build comb against the glass, and you can see them do all sorts of amazing things. And here's what happens when the forager comes home. Here's this is the unloader bee accepting liquid, the nectar from the forager bee. See, the forager is opening its mandibles, and the unloader bee is accepting that liquid with its proboscis. Okay, and then here is a bee that's ripening the nectar. You see it's releasing some of the nectar and then taking it back into its crop or its mouth parts. And this is sort of a diagram of how the proboscis opens and then goes back as the liquid comes in and out. It's not a very good diagram here, but you have to kind of use your imagination. And then these little droplets are inside of the honey cell. So if your hive is on a honey flow, you can tip that frame horizontally and see if you can splash the nectar out. And if you can, then it's not ripe. The bees are in the process of making honey, which is a good thing. If it won't splash out, then it's just about ripe. And you splash it into the hive, don't worry, the bees will clean that up and make it back into honey. So in the honey production process, water is evaporated from the nectar, and then you got to get it down to under 18% water. And the worker bees will fan their wings. It's a little easier for them if it's hot and dry outside. You can evaporate that water, and the bees split sucrose into glucose and fructose. And this chemical process consumes water also. It helps to get that honey really dry, which is what we want. Some of the glucose is converted into gluconic acid, which makes the honey slightly acidic, about like vinegar. And there's a little bit of hydrogen peroxide produced, which is also antibiotic. So this makes it possible for that very rich material we call honey to stay inside the hive at a warm temperature without spoiling. And that's pretty remarkable. I mean, you'd think, gosh, something with all that sugar and all those vitamins, that would really spoil quickly, but it doesn't, because the water content is low. It's a little bit acidic, and a tiny bit of hydrogen peroxide is in there, which kills microbes. So I actually have a jar of honey that was given to me by a Shelby County beekeeper. The honey was produced, he told me the honey was produced in the 1970s. And I've tasted it. It's not fermented. It actually tastes pretty good. It's black as coal, but it tastes pretty good because of these processes that keep microbes from growing in it. But honey doesn't really last forever. It does change in some ways. Most honey will crystallize eventually, which is glucose crystal formation, especially depending on the flowers that produce the nectar, like canola, for example, which has a lot of glucose in it. And some people say, well, that's turned to sugar, but it's not really turned to sugar. It's just that the sugar has changed from dissolved into crystal. Okay, the sugar has just changed its condition, but the amount of sugar is exactly the same. Also, honey can ferment if we get a rainy period. This is a real concern, because once it starts fermenting, it's not really good for people at all. Maybe the bees can eat it, but we get a very rainy period, we've got to watch out that we're not harvesting unripe honey that allows yeast to grow in it. And then you get these little bubbles and you get a bad taste in it. So mead can be fermented if we're very careful about how we do that. All honey will darken. If you have a jar of honey, it's been on your shelf for several years, you can see it's start to darken. If it's 10 years old, it is pretty dark. And then my honey, which is over 40 years old, is very, very dark. Another thing that can happen is that sugars will turn into this stuff called hydroxymethylfurforaldehyde. That's a great word for Scrabble, if you can get that down on the board. Or just call it HMF. Any kind of sugars or honey or whatever can convert to this, especially if it's been heated. So when we're extracting honey, we should not overheat our honey. We warm the honey briefly and just to get it through the filters and then let it cool down and into the bottles, but don't warm it for, a really long time. That's not a good thing because HMF is a little bit toxic to people and to bees both. What about honeydew? Well, honeydew originates from sap sucking insects like an aphid. This is an aphid that's piercing some of the vascular tissue of a plant, sucking the liquid out, and it's getting liquid that's full of water and sugar, but it's low in vitamins. So what it does is it secretes the extra water, sugary water, and it tries to hold on to the vitamins and amino acids and so forth that's in the tissue. So the sugary water is kind of a waste product for an aphid, and bees will find that and collect it, and it turns into something we call honeydew. It's not honey, of course, and then that gets stored, and it's not bad. If you have bees near a forest and there's an outbreak of insects, you might get some honeydew. Some people like it, some people don't. It tastes a little bit different. There's nothing unhealthy about it, and of course it's not true honey. But if you have bees near a forest, especially if there's an outbreak of insects, or maybe if there's been a drought and the trees are suffering, that's where you can get this sort of thing. One time I had my car parked under a tree in my driveway, and I went out and saw all these little sticky spots on my windshield. And I knew exactly what it was, and I got out a ladder and went up in the tree, and sure enough, there are a whole bunch of little critters up in the tree. This is a scale insect, and like aphids, it feeds on the sap, on the plant juices here, and releases little drops of sticky liquid, which can fall onto your car or fall onto anything, and can be gathered by bees. And then here's the hypopharyngeal gland in the head of the bee, which produces the honey ripening enzymes and also the liquid food for larvae and the queen. Salivary glands also help the ripening of honey and in the production of royal jelly and worker jelly. And if we look into a queen cell, this is looking from the bottom up into a queen cell. We opened this up a little bit and we're looking down in. We can see all of this very rich food that's produced by the nurse bees. And this larva is about 2 days old, about 4 days old. They grow very, very quickly because they're given this perfect food. No pollen, nothing more than what they actually need. And of course, they're kept warm. And so that's good because then the bees can rear queens quickly. And sometimes the hive really needs to rear queens quickly. As I mentioned earlier, it's analogous to milk produced by mammals, a highly digestible and nutritious food which allows the young to grow very rapidly. If you're harvesting royal jelly for commercial purposes or whatever, you probably want to get it at about this stage when the larva is pretty small, because otherwise it's going to consume all the royal jelly you want to harvest. So usually you go about a day and a half, 2 days after grafting into the cup. Are these things nutritious for people, pollen and royal jelly? Well, they have lots of nutrients in, but we don't know that they're really better than a typical conventional diet that we might have. And we can see that the amount of royal jelly is going to disappear very quickly once the larva gets big. Might be almost none left if you wait too long to harvest it. And I've calculated that if you want to make money by selling royal jelly, well, even if you're really good, I don't think you can get rich doing this, because if you look at what a jar of royal jelly goes for, oops, let me go back here. A jar of royal jelly goes for, if you figure out how much beekeeping you would have to do and how much jelly scooping you would have to do, if everything went perfect and the weather was perfect and your bees were really good, you would be making about $2 an hour, I would say, and just to make royal jelly for sale in a way that would be competitive on the market. So probably not a good get-rich-quick scheme, I don't think. I suspect that a lot of royal jelly on the market maybe has a little bit of something else in it. That's just my hunch. Okay, just a little bit about water foraging. bees do need a stable spot to perch. Okay, now swimming pools are bad because they have vertical sides. Bees need some place where they can get in there and put their proboscis into the water without getting washed in. So if you have neighbors complaining about bees at your swimming pool, here's what I did. Set up an alternative source of water. It's wide and shallow. Put it in full sunlight, like a wading pool for toddlers. Then what I do is carry pool toys with the bees from the swimming pool to the new water source. Then I apply insect repellent to the edges and the ladder of the swimming pool where the bees have been perching. And any kind of insect repellent with DEET works very well. It keeps bees away as well as mosquitoes. And then keep repeating this, and eventually the bees will not go back to the swimming pool. They'll go only onto this new alternative source of water. I tried this in my own yard for my own kids, and it actually worked. This is what the bees should be doing. See them all lined up here. This is like a bucket or something full of water, and you can see how important it is for them all to be loading up. And here's the happy camper. This is the one that was complaining to me. He says, "Dad, the bees are in the swimming pool again. Get your bees out of the pool." So that's when I figured I had to do something to get the bees out of the pool. And you can see there's none of them around the edge. And this guy is happy now. He's a little bit older now, but still no bees in the pool. So that's wraps it up for questions and comments. If anybody wants to say anything.
That's a great question. I don't know if you're able to hear Pat. Pat asks, what happens with the queen, because she doesn't take these cleansing flights?
Yeah, that's right. Well, the queen actually defecates inside the hive, and then workers bees clean up after her. Okay, it kind of sounds like a kind of a rolling job, but that's what happens for royalty, right? People clean up after them. Queen does not fly out for a cleansing flight. The workers clean up after her. And actually, it seems that she releases a little bit of pheromone in doing so. And since she eats very little pollen, she does not produce very much waste.
Great. I actually had a video on Ocba County Beekeepers Facebook page of a queen bee that just emerged out of her cell. And within a second, she really went big time on my hand. And
yeah.
I thought the same thing as Pat. I'm thinking, who takes care of that?
Yeah. Worker bees.
Yeah.
The proventriculus, it has those fingers that go in. That's for polishing pollen out of the crop, correct?
Yeah, just imagine these fingers reaching into the crop and pulling particles like pollen grains out of the crop and into the midgut. They're like little feathers.
I always wondered how it did that. I knew it had that function, but I didn't know it had this.
Yeah. Some people have been able to actually watch this happen. It's kind of tricky because you got to open up a live bee and look in with a microscope. I've never actually done that, but apparently that's what actually happens.
Okay. Any other questions?
I thought it was interesting the size of pollen is typically around 10 microns.
Yeah.
And when we extract honey, our sieves are around 300 microns. So obviously, all pollen goes through the sieve and is in our honey, which is what people want.
Yeah. Maybe the biggest pollen grains. There's some pollen grains that are as big as 20 microns, and some that are maybe down to 5 microns. But all that pollen is going through the typical honey filters, and as you say, there's probably some health benefits to that.
I always thought it was the pollen grains that started the crystallization process. I thought it was interesting that it's actually the high glucose.
Yeah. Well, the pollen grains could play a role too, because when liquids crystallize, a lot of times there's particles that seed the crystals.
Yeah.
And so the pollen grains may be a part of it, but I think the most important part is the floral source. If you have flowers that are rich in glucose nectar.
Yeah, typically my honey, like my spring honey, is already starting to become opaque. Where when I first harvested it was transparent pretty much. We have pretty light honey here, but now it's actually opaque. You can't see through it, so it's already starting that concentration process.
The other thing is temperature. If you keep your honey warm or very cold, it's less likely to crystallize. The worst temperature is about 55 degrees, which is like somebody's cool basement. And this is sort of a chemistry thing, but the crystals form much more readily at about 55. If you want to keep some honey for a long time, maybe something really special for a Christmas present or something, you can put it in your freezer. And that will be cold enough that it will inhibit crystallization. And so like if you're going to enter it into the fair or do something where you really care about it being nice and transparent, you can do that.
Thank you.
Tom, do the bees have a preference for eating pollen versus nectar versus bee bread versus honey?
Bees are pretty good, like a lot of animals, they're pretty good at eating what they need to eat. And so if they're starved for pollen, man, they will really go for it. They sometimes will collect things that aren't really even pollen. They'll collect sawdust or all sorts of things. They'll collect the powdery stuff in animal feed troughs and bird feeders and all sorts of things. There's a lady who had a problem with bees going to a bird feeder because they're picking up sort of the pulverized bird feed as if it were pollen. So those bees were really pollen starved. And so they really have this instinct. And as far as nectar, likewise, there's sometimes when they are really, really desperate for something sweet, and they will do whatever they can to get that. So bees are pretty good at regulating what they need as long as they have an opportunity to get it.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah.
For those of us who use heated bottling tanks, what is like the suggested upper limit to the temperature so you don't overheat the honey?
Oh, so you don't overheat the honey? I'm not sure. I'd have to look it up. But yeah, I'd have to look that up. If you look up, HMF production, I'm sure it's on the internet as to what temperatures. Same thing for like corn syrup. If the corn syrup is sitting in a railroad car on the railroad tracks and in the hot summer sun, and maybe it's a black car and it's just really getting warm, that's the perfect conditions for HMF production. And so that's not good. So any kind of sugars can turn into HMF that way. I don't know the ideal temperature, but I would try to keep the honey at room temperature for as long as possible. Just warm it immediately before it goes through the filters.
You can take honey up to 105 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's still considered raw. Now that said, I've got a heating system that takes it to 110 and holds it there. Yeah. And if you forget about honey for 6 months in the heating system, it will decompose on it. It will start to break down. Slowly, very slowly, but it will start to decompose. Excellent. Any other questions? Tom, thank you for your time this evening. It was very informative.
Okay, good.
Really very interesting.
Y'all getting your bees ready for winter? Okay. Thanks. Well, I hope to see you all in person sometime soon.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for joining us. At this point, I'm going to shut off the Zoom.
Okay.
And we'll jump to our business meeting.
Okay, good.
Thank you again, Tom.